I remember that summer feeling warmer than usual, as if the air itself was charged with old secrets and restless spirits. Our small town, Maplewood, had always taken pride in its traditions, but that year's ancestral festival seemed to stir something deeper. The festival was an old custom passed down through generations, meant to honor those who came before us. Each family contributed something personal to the celebration: handwritten recipes, heirlooms, pressed flowers, and then gathered under the old oak tree by the creek to share stories, sing folk tunes, and drink spice cider well into the night. My wife, Emily, was excited from the start. She had grown up listening to her grandparents' tales about how this particular festival brought distant relatives back into the fold, forging bonds that could outlast the greatest hardships. I, on the other hand, felt a quiet discomfort that I couldn't quite explain. Maybe it was because my own family tree had shallow roots in Maplewood. My parents had moved here from out of state before I was born, and although I knew the neighbors well enough, I never felt truly woven into the tapestry of local lineage. Still, I tried my best to embrace Emily's enthusiasm. She was passionate about restoring family ties, especially after losing her grandmother the previous winter. That loss left Emily clinging to traditions more fiercely than ever, determined not to let her family's legacy slip through her fingers. So when she mentioned inviting an old relative from a neighboring town, someone apparently connected through a branch of her grandmother's cousins, I nodded along, happy to see her so hopeful. The woman's name was Margaret, and according to Emily, she had once lived in Maplewood but moved away decades ago. Now in her early 40s, Margaret had been described to Emily only through a few faded photographs and whispered anecdotes. "She's family," Emily said simply. "We should welcome her." I tried to picture Margaret, probably tall and lean, with eyes reminiscent of Emily's grandmother, gray-green like the moss along the creek bed. I imagined someone kind and soft-spoken, maybe a bit shy, someone who would arrive with an old family brooch or a bundle of letters tied in ribbon. Emily was so excited she cleaned the guest room twice and bought fresh lilies for the dresser, insisting that every detail had to be perfect. Part of me was grateful. The festival often felt like a chore, but Emily's excitement was infectious. If having Margaret here would help Emily feel connected again, who was I to object? It was just before dusk when Margaret arrived. I was outside, hammering in a loose fence post, when I heard Emily call my name. I turned and saw my wife standing at the porch steps, smiling broadly. Next to her stood Margaret, holding a small leather suitcase, dressed in a simple linen blouse and jeans. She had a calm, steady presence and, to my surprise, looked not much older than we were. Emily and I were in our mid-30s, and Margaret seemed close to that age, maybe just a few years older. She had dark hair pulled into a loose braid, and her eyes were indeed a soft green. But there was something else in them, something knowing, something that made me feel slightly uneasy. I approached with a smile, wiping sweat from my brow. I extended my hand, introducing myself. Margaret took it warmly and said, "It's wonderful to finally meet both of you. I've heard so much about Maplewood from my mother." Her voice was low and smooth, carrying a gentle southern lilt that hinted at her life away from here. Emily was practically glowing. "We're so glad you made it. I know it's been a long time since anyone from your side of the family has come back for the festival." Margaret nodded, glancing around at our yard. The old swing under the maple tree, the small vegetable garden we tended behind the garage. She took it all in with a subtle smile that bordered on nostalgia. It's been a while indeed. For a moment, I wondered if Emily and Margaret had known each other before. The familiarity between them felt immediate and strong, as if they shared a secret I wasn't privy to. But I shook it off. After all, Emily had written a series of letters and emails before inviting Margaret. Maybe they had bonded over stories of Emily's grandmother, forging a friendship before ever meeting face to face. That evening, as the sky darkened, we sat on the porch and talked. I let the two of them carry the conversation. They discussed family history, the old shops that used to line Maplewood's Main Street, and the orchard that once belonged to Emily's grandparents. Margaret asked thoughtful questions, and Emily answered eagerly, sometimes looking at me as if to say, "Isn't this great?" I would nod, still a bit uneasy, though I couldn't say why. Once or twice, I noticed Margaret's gaze linger on me, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if studying my face or my posture. Each time I caught her, she would look away, her expression turning pleasant and warm again. As night settled in, I offered to fix us a simple dinner. Emily and Margaret remained on the porch, chatting softly. I stood by the kitchen window, chopping tomatoes for a salad, and watched them. The porch light cast them in a gentle glow, and I could see Emily laughing at something Margaret said. Margaret reached out and touched Emily's arm lightly, a casual gesture, but something about it struck me as too intimate for newly acquainted relatives. Or maybe I was imagining things. It wouldn't be the first time my mind jumped to the wrong conclusion. Yet, my instincts told me something was off. I wanted to trust Emily, trust that this visit was what she claimed it to be, but the subtle closeness between them, the way they leaned in, the quiet understanding passing between their eyes, was hard to ignore. When I brought dinner out, Emily looked at me with such happiness that my doubts felt petty and cruel. Margaret complimented my cooking, and we shared a pleasant meal under the lantern's light, listening to crickets sing. They talked about tomorrow's festival, how Margaret wanted to bring a small box of old family letters and read a few aloud if that would be welcome. Emily was thrilled at the idea. I smiled and nodded, forcing myself to match their enthusiasm. After dinner, Emily gave Margaret a short tour of the house. I followed behind at a slight distance, watching how Margaret's hand sometimes brushed against the small of Emily's back, or how Emily's laughter sounded a touch lighter than usual. In our guest room, Margaret admired the lilies and commented on the scent. Emily beamed, happy that her efforts were noticed. Standing there, I tried to imagine how I'd feel if I discovered this was something more than a distant cousin's visit. The thought made my stomach tighten. Late that night, after we all said goodnight, I lay awake in bed while Emily slept soundly beside me. I could hear the distant hum of cars on the highway and the soft creak of the old farmhouse walls. I pictured Margaret in the guest room, perhaps reading through her letters, thinking about what stories to share tomorrow. I wondered if she carried another story, one not meant to be told publicly, a story about her real connection to my wife. The idea was unsettling, but I couldn't dismiss it. There was too much warmth in her gaze, too much understanding in Emily's eyes when they looked at each other. Tomorrow would be the festival. Families would gather under the old oak, share memories, and strengthen their bonds. I tried to convince myself that Margaret's presence would enrich Emily's sense of family, help her heal after the loss of her grandmother. Yet something deep inside warned me that tomorrow's sunlight would reveal more than we intended, that the truth woven through these old traditions would come with a cost none of us had anticipated. The next morning, sunlight spilled over Maplewood's main street, as if trying to brighten every secret corner. The ancestral festival wouldn't begin until the afternoon, but the town was already stirring with activity. Children chased each other behind white picket fences, and neighbors hung ribbons and lanterns in their yards. I watched from our porch, sipping my coffee and trying to ignore the uneasy tension in my chest. Inside, I could hear Emily and Margaret chatting softly, voices weaving together, punctuated by light laughter. There was a softness in their tone, a warmth I couldn't quite place, and it fueled my restlessness. As I stepped inside, both women greeted me warmly. Margaret held a small wooden box tied with a faded piece of lace, presumably the letters she planned to share at the festival. Emily's eyes shone with excitement, and I wondered how she could appear so carefree. Didn't she see how close Margaret stood to her, how effortlessly their shoulders brushed when they leaned over the breakfast table? We decided to walk to the festival grounds together. It was only a short distance from our home to the old oak tree by the creek. This tree, with its wide, gnarled branches, was where families placed their contributions, recited old stories, and listened to whispered legends of ancestors who settled Maplewood long before any of us were born. As we approached, other families were arriving, setting down baskets of homemade bread, bottles of cider, and carefully folded quilts that bore the stitches of many generations. The atmosphere was cheerful, voices drifting in a gentle hum. Emily guided Margaret to a small area by the tree's massive roots, where people were seated on blankets, passing around family artifacts. I hovered a few steps back, pretending to admire a display of embroidered handkerchiefs. In truth, I was studying them both, my eyes flickering between Emily's bright smile and Margaret's calm gaze. I tried to pick up on any subtle tension or coded glance that might confirm my suspicion. Margaret's hand occasionally rested on Emily's forearm when she spoke, a gesture that looked more intimate than familial. As the crowd settled, a respected elder of the town, a gray-haired man named Robert, welcomed everyone and invited them to share their stories. One by one, people stood and recounted memories. A great-great-grandfather who founded the first bakery, a courageous aunt who saved a neighbor's life during a harsh winter, a pair of sweethearts who planted the rose bushes that still bloomed each spring. Each tale knit the community closer together. Emily nudged Margaret forward when it was her turn. Margaret rose gracefully, holding her wooden box, and cleared her throat. "These letters," she began, voice steady, "belong to my mother. They talk about her life here in Maplewood, the friends she made, and the family she loved." One of these letters mentions Emily's grandmother, Evelyn. Heads turned. Everyone knew Evelyn's kind reputation. Margaret opened a letter and began to read, her voice weaving a soft tapestry of old names, weathered hopes, and dreams that once filled these fields and orchards. As Margaret spoke, I noticed how Emily watched her. She didn't just listen. She leaned in, eyes shining with admiration. It was as if the letter's gentle words cast a spell that bound them closer. Even I, suspicious as I was, felt a strange warmth at the sound of these old-fashioned sentences. But under that warmth lingered a sharp discomfort. Emily's gaze on Margaret looked more than appreciative. It resembled longing. When Margaret finished reading, people clapped softly. Some nodded with tears in their eyes, grateful for this gentle reminder of those who came before. The applause faded, and Emily reached out to squeeze Margaret's hand. In that simple gesture, I saw something that set my heart pounding. It was too tender, too familiar. I remembered how Emily used to look at me that way in the early years of our marriage, before routine and small disappointments dulled the shine of our companionship. I excused myself, muttering something about needing fresh air, though we were already outside. Stepping away from the crowd, I followed a narrow path that led toward the creek's bend. The old oak's long roots knuckled through the earth, forming small hollows filled with moss and tiny white flowers. I crouched by the water's edge, trying to steady my breathing and my thoughts. Was I jumping to conclusions? Wasn't it possible that Emily was simply overwhelmed by the nostalgia, the sense of connection? Perhaps she saw in Margaret a living link to her grandmother's era. Maybe I was jealous, reading too much into a look or a touch. But as I trailed back toward the gathering, I caught sight of them again. Emily and Margaret stood a few yards from the main group, partially concealed by the oak's thick trunk and the low-hanging branches. They whispered quietly, faces close, oblivious to anyone's gaze. I stepped behind a cluster of people to watch without being seen. Margaret's voice was too low to hear, but I noticed how Emily bit her lip and nodded slowly, as if absorbing some confession or promise. Margaret reached out and brushed a strand of hair from Emily's face. The gesture was intimate, affectionate, like lovers sharing a private moment. I felt something tighten in my chest. A rush of anger, betrayal, and confusion flooded through me. This was wrong, all wrong. Emily and I had never discussed such feelings. As far as I knew, she'd never shown an interest in women before. But the heart is a strange creature, and love can take unexpected shapes. Yet no matter the form, This secret blossoming right before me was tearing down the trust one thought we shared. I tried to calm myself. Maybe I needed proof that went beyond subtle touches and stolen glances. What if I confronted them now, accusing Emily and Margaret before understanding the full truth? I could lose everything, ruin the festival, shame Emily publicly. No, I needed to be certain. I backed away, slipping behind a row of guests who were busy sharing stories. My mind churned. I would have to watch them carefully, wait for the right moment. If their bond was truly what I feared, sooner or later they would reveal themselves more plainly. The festival continued, families taking turns presenting their stories. At one point, Emily and Margaret separated for a while. Margaret moved among the crowd, asking questions about old traditions, while Emily spoke with a few distant cousins. When Emily finally looked in my direction, I forced a smile and waved. She waved back, her smile bright but slightly hesitant. Perhaps she felt my unease. Perhaps she knew I had begun to suspect. As the afternoon wore on, guests drifted into smaller groups. Some wandered toward the orchard at the edge of the property, where ancestors once harvested apples and pears each autumn. I followed at a distance as Emily and Margaret joined a group heading that way. The orchard's winding paths were lined with old, twisted trees heavy with unripe fruit. Beneath these branches, whispers carried easily, and I made sure to stay far enough behind to avoid detection. Margaret slowed, letting the others go ahead. Emily paused beside her, and they lingered near a tree that leaned precariously, supported by a wooden brace. No one else was around. They'd chosen a quiet spot outside the earshot of curious neighbors. I inched closer, half hidden by the orchard's tangled growth. I could make out fragments of their conversation, carried by a soft breeze. "I told you," Margaret said quietly. "It was never simple." Emily's voice was muffled, but I caught her reply, "I know. But coming back here, seeing you again, it's harder than I thought." My pulse quickened. So they had known each other before. This wasn't just a casual distant relative's visit. They had a past, and it sounded personal, deeply personal. Margaret stepped forward and took Emily's hand. My wife looked conflicted, her eyes darting over Margaret's face as if searching for reassurance. "We can't pretend," Margaret said, her tone gentle but firm. "Not when these feelings never went away." My stomach dropped. It felt as though the ground had cracked beneath me, roots and soil giving way. Emily's silence was more telling than any explanation. If this was some old flame rekindled, then everything I understood about our marriage was a half-truth. She had invited Margaret here not just to honor family ties, but to reawaken something that had been sleeping between them, something secret and powerful enough to challenge the life Emily and I built together. I fought the urge to burst out from my hiding place and demand answers. Instead, I clenched my fists and tried to think clearly. If I confronted them now, would I gain clarity or push them deeper into denial? As painful as it was, I decided to wait, to gather more proof. I needed to know just how deep this betrayal ran before I made my move. Let them think they were safe in the orchard's quiet shade. Let them reveal the truth in their own time. Then, when the moment was right, I would face them both and force the secrets into the open. I spent the rest of the afternoon moving through the festival like a ghost drifting between familiar shapes. People greeted me, but I barely registered their words. My mind was too crowded with what I'd seen and heard beneath the orchard trees. I needed more clarity before I confronted Emily. If I rushed in without understanding the depth of her connection to Margaret, I might miss something important. After the orchard gathering, the festival spread into various corners of Maplewood's common grounds. Some folks prepared an evening bonfire. Others organized a makeshift stage for singing old folk songs. I hovered near the food tables, pretending to be interested in a platter of homemade pastries. In truth, I watched Emily and Margaret from a distance. They no longer stayed glued to each other's side, but moved through the crowd separately, occasionally exchanging glances that crackled with hidden meaning. At one point, I saw Emily chatting with an older neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, a woman known for her long memory and fondness for telling stories of the town's past. Margaret stood a few steps away, examining a worn quilt spread over a log bench. I made my way around the perimeter, circling slowly until I was close enough to Mrs. Peterson to catch snippets of conversation. Emily asked about traditions from decades ago, and Mrs. Peterson obliged with a tale of young girls who used to write secret messages under loose floorboards in the old community hall. It was innocent chatter, but I noticed Emily's voice grow softer when Margaret edged closer, as if to ensure she could overhear. When Margaret drifted off, I took a chance. I approached Mrs. Peterson with a smile, commented on the lovely weather, and then casually steered the conversation toward family histories. That woman who came to the festival, Margaret, is she really related to Emily's family? I asked, keeping my tone light. Mrs. Peterson squinted, tapping her chin as if sorting through dusty mental files. Margaret, yes, I recall hearing that her mother's family lived here ages ago, but I'm not sure how directly she's related. Folks moved around so much. I pressed gently. Do you remember Margaret visiting before? Mrs. Peterson shook her head. Not since I've been old enough to pay attention, though I do remember Emily as a teenager was close with a girl who left town suddenly. They spent a lot of time down by the creek, whispering and laughing. Folks thought they were best friends, but then one summer the other girl vanished. No one knew why. Emily changed after that, became quieter. Could Margaret be that girl, all grown up? She gave me a curious look, as if gauging my reaction. My heart sank. This wasn't just a distant cousin reappearing for sentimental reasons. If Margaret was indeed that girl from Emily's youth, then their bond ran far deeper than any passing acquaintance. It explained the familiarity, the warmth, the way they stood close as if gravity itself pulled them together. They had history, an old connection that likely never fully died. I thanked Mrs. Peterson and moved away, my mind spinning. I needed something concrete, a piece of evidence that would confirm their intentions. My chance came when I noticed Margaret speaking with a small group near the edge of the festival grounds, while Emily was drawn into a conversation with a distant relative about family recipes. Leaving them both occupied, I slipped back toward our home, walking briskly through the quiet streets. The festival had drawn most of the town to the common area, so the neighborhood felt still. I entered the house and headed straight for the guest room where Margaret slept. It felt wrong to invade her privacy, but she had already invaded my marriage. Inside, the lilies Emily had placed were starting to droop slightly, their scent heavier now. A neat suitcase stood by the dresser. I hesitated, then opened it gently. My hands trembled. Beneath neatly folded clothes, I found a small leather-bound journal tied with a ribbon. Inside were pressed flowers and notes, some dated 15 years ago. As I skimmed the pages, I discovered references to a girl named Emily, snippets about late-night walks, secret smiles, plans to run away together. It was all there, a youthful romance abruptly ended. There were entries filled with longing and heartbreak after their forced separation. The final pages were more recent, describing the anticipation and fear Margaret felt about returning, about seeing Emily again, and finding out if the old feelings still burned. I closed the journal, my chest tight. This was no misunderstanding. Margaret had come here for Emily, not for some ancestral tradition, but to rekindle what they once shared. And Emily had responded to that spark, willingly or not. I put the journal back exactly as I found it, my mind racing. Now I had proof beyond suspicious touches and whispers. By the time I returned to the festival, dusk had settled. Paper lanterns swung from tree branches, casting a gentle glow over the gathering. People laughed, danced in small circles, and sipped cider from wooden cups. I spotted Emily near the bonfire, her face illuminated by the flickering light. Margaret stood a short distance away, speaking to another guest. They were careful not to stand too close, but the tension between them was unmistakable. Emily's eyes slid over to Margaret when she thought no one was looking, and Margaret's gaze found Emily's form even when she pretended to be interested in the firelight. I clenched my jaw, wondering how I should act. Should I confront Emily now, pulling her aside and demanding the truth? The thought made my stomach twist. I wasn't sure I could handle the answer at this very moment. A confrontation in front of half the town would be reckless. Instead, I wandered closer to the fire, staying on the opposite side, so I could observe without attracting attention. A few people began singing an old folk song. Voices mingled, rising and falling with gentle melodies passed down through generations. It should have been a comforting sound, yet I felt only a hollow ache. Every sweet note seemed to mock the trust one once had in my marriage. My eyes drifted over the silhouettes of Emily and Margaret. Emily stood with her arms folded, a posture that could suggest comfort or restraint. When Margaret glanced her way, Emily nodded softly, almost imperceptibly, and in that nod, I sensed an agreement, a promise that once everyone was asleep, they might talk freely, far from prying eyes. I had to prepare myself for a final test. If they met in secret, I would follow. I needed to see the truth laid bare, however painful. So I waited. The festival wound down gradually. Families drifted home with tired children on their shoulders. Neighbors said goodnight, and lanterns were carefully snuffed out one by one. Emily caught up with me near the tables stacked with empty plates. She smiled, a bit too brightly, and asked if I was ready to head home. I nodded, feigning fatigue and keeping my voice steady. She seemed relieved, and I wondered what she thought I knew, if anything. Back home, we readied ourselves for bed. The guest room door was closed, and no light shone underneath it. Emily didn't mention Margaret's letters, the reading at the festival, or the orchard walk. Instead, she talked about how nice it was to see everyone coming together. Her voice was gentle, but I sensed a strain. Maybe she was trying to act normal, hoping I hadn't noticed the subtle dance she and Margaret performed all day. Maybe she trusted that I would remain blind. If Margaret and Emily planned to meet tonight, they would have to step quietly through the house or arrange a rendezvous outside. Either way, I would be there in the shadows watching. I needed no more half-truths or assumptions. I would catch them in a moment that could not be explained away by family ties or nostalgic dreams. An hour passed, and then another. Just as I began to think they might not dare meet, I heard a soft creak in the hallway. My heart pounded, and I rose silently, padding across the floor and peeking out through a narrow gap in the door. In the dim light, I saw a figure moving toward the back door, someone trying to be invisible. It was Emily, slipping out into the warm summer night. My stomach lurched. She wasn't going for a midnight stroll alone. I knew where she was heading and whom she was going to see. I pulled on my shoes and crept after her, determined that by sunrise, I would know exactly where we stood. I followed Emily through the stillness of our neighborhood, each step measured, each breath quiet. The moon was bright enough to cast long shadows across the lawns and picket fences, and I tried to stay within those darker stretches, careful not to snap a twig or crunch a stray leaf. Emily moved with purpose, glancing back over her shoulder now and then. I flattened myself against a hedge when she paused by the corner street lamp, its glow muted by a cloud of insects. She seemed nervous, uncertain, but still determined. After a moment, she continued on, heading toward the old orchard behind the festival grounds. The evening's festivities were long finished, and no lanterns remained to guide her way. Yet Emily navigated the dim landscape as if drawn by instinct, following a path that wound between crooked trees and low stone walls. I recalled the orchard as a place of innocence, somewhere children played hide-and-seek, where couples strolled hand in hand. Tonight, it felt like a stage set for a secret drama. As I crept behind a leaning apple tree, I spotted Margaret's silhouette near a small clearing. She wore a light jacket and kept her arms wrapped around herself, as if shielding against a chill that wasn't really there. When Emily emerged from the shadows, Margaret's face lit up with relief and something warmer, an affection so plain it made my chest tighten. They stood close, shoulders nearly touching, voices low. I dared not move closer than a dozen paces, in fear of giving myself away, but I could still pick out fragments of their words in the hush of night. A breeze stirred the leaves, and beneath that soft rustling I caught phrases that stung like nettles. "I never stopped thinking about us," Margaret murmured. Emily replied, "I was afraid you'd forgotten." Their voices wove together, carrying a tenderness that felt painfully intimate. Margaret took Emily's hand, lifting it gently. The moonlight outlined their profiles, turning them into figures in an old photograph. Emily sighed, and even from my distance, I sensed the weight of years slipping off her shoulders. She leaned in, resting her forehead against Margaret's temple, as if seeking comfort in familiar warmth. My throat tightened. This was no fleeting attraction, no random infidelity. It was a rekindling of a bond that predated my place in Emily's life. I had stumbled into a story that began long before I knew her name. I caught another snatch of conversation. "Leaving you was never my choice," Margaret said, voice trembling slightly. "They made my mother take me away. I wrote letters, but they were never answered." Emily shook her head. "I never got any letters," she whispered. "I waited. I hoped until I forced myself to believe you'd moved on." Margaret reached up, brushing the edge of Emily's cheek with her fingertips. "I should have tried harder. I should have come back sooner." My heart pounded. The mention of letters explained some of the mystery. Margaret's journal, those pressed flowers, her nostalgic return. The world felt inverted, as if I was an intruder in my own marriage, eavesdropping on a love story that somehow survived decades of silence. I wanted to speak, to demand answers, to claim Emily's loyalty. But I stood frozen, pinned between heartbreak and morbid curiosity. If I revealed myself now, would it even matter? Their emotions ran so deep that my presence might only confirm what they already knew, that my role was secondary, a chapter added onto a narrative that had always belonged to them. They spoke quietly, making plans in half-formed sentences. Margaret mentioned traveling together, maybe finding a place that welcomed them without judgment. Emily hesitated, her voice catching on the word husband. My stomach twisted at that. Here was the acknowledgement of my existence, but in a tone that suggested complication rather than devotion. Emily confessed, "I don't know how to leave the life I built. He's good to me, he doesn't deserve." Her words trailed off, and Margaret gently pressed her fingertips to Emily's lips, silencing her. "You deserve to be happy," Margaret said simply. I dug my nails into my palms, trying to stay calm. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to step forward, confront them, shout that I, too, deserved some measure of happiness and honesty. But I held back, waiting for more. Emily's shoulders shook slightly, and I realized she was crying, quiet tears that only Margaret could see. Margaret drew her closer, wrapping an arm around her waist. They stood like that for several minutes, whispering reassurances I could barely make out. Something about time, something about promises they had once made under these very trees. The orchard was a silent witness, its trees heavy with the fruit of old secrets. I had never felt so powerless. My life had always seemed straightforward: love, marriage, a home in a friendly town. Now I saw that beneath that calm surface, Emily carried a hidden longing. She had tried to be the person I needed her to be, to fulfill the expectations we'd set together. But the moment Margaret returned, all those carefully constructed walls began to crumble. I considered my next move carefully. If I rushed in with accusations, would Emily deny everything? Would Margaret vanish again, leaving Emily torn in half? Or would they unite against me, their bond stronger than my claims on Emily's heart? The uncertainty weighed on me. Part of me wanted to let them know I was here, to force a confrontation and end the suspense. Another part wanted to retreat, to find some safer path. But there was no safe path. We were all caught in a web of old emotions, and the only way out was through the truth. As I watched, Margaret lifted her face, and Emily leaned in. They kissed softly. No fireworks, no dramatic gestures, just the quiet intimacy of two people who had longed for this moment across years of separation. My chest hurt. It felt like witnessing something sacred and heartbreaking at once, a reunion that was never meant for my eyes. When they parted, Emily pressed her face into Margaret's shoulder. I could hear the murmur of her voice. "I can't live a lie anymore." Margaret just held her, stroking her hair. The simplicity of that gesture enraged me and broke me in equal measure. Emily was declaring that our life, our marriage, had been a lie. Maybe not entirely, but enough to make this moment possible. I wondered how I ever missed the signs, how I ever thought I knew her completely. They stepped back, looking around as if to ensure their secrecy. I shrank behind my tree, holding my breath, praying they wouldn't spot my shape in the shadows. Emily wiped her eyes, trying to regain composure. Margaret placed a gentle kiss on her forehead and whispered, "Whatever you decide, I'm here now. I'm not going anywhere." With those words, they turned to leave, heading back toward town. I remained behind, rooted to the spot, shaken to my core. Their footsteps grew distant, but my mind raced. Emily would return to our home, slip under the sheets, and pretend she was just out for a late stroll or couldn't sleep. Perhaps she would tell me something vague if I asked, or maybe she'd lie. The cruelty of it all felt unbearable. Yet I had no one to blame except them and maybe fate itself. The orchard's silence pressed in on me. I needed to decide what to do next. Should I confront Emily the moment she came through the door? Should I gather my belongings and leave without a word? Or should I wait for morning? Try to find a moment when we could talk calmly, without secrets and half-truths? Anger flared in my chest. They had stolen my peace of mind, broken the vows we made. But as I trudged back through the orchard, I realized this betrayal was rooted in something older, deeper, a love that predated my entry into Emily's life. That thought offered no comfort, only a bitter understanding. I was the outsider here, stumbling upon a legacy of longing and regret that had never truly ended. When I reached the edge of the orchard, I paused, taking one last look at the moonlit trees. Tomorrow, everything would change. I had proof, understanding, and a choice. I could demand honesty, lay it all out, or slip into silent resentment. None of these options felt good, but I couldn't remain passive. Emily would have to face the consequences of her silence, Margaret her bold return, and I my decision to stand and fight or walk away. With heavy steps, I made my way home, bracing myself for the confrontation that would reshape our lives. I returned to the house in a silence so deep I could almost hear the rhythm of my own heartbeat. The door's hinges gave a soft groan as I stepped inside, and I paused in the darkness, scanning the living room for any sign that Emily had beaten me here. Nothing stirred. The clock on the mantel marked the passing minutes with quiet ticks, an indifferent witness to the unraveling of our marriage. I stood there, gathering courage, pushing aside fear and hurt. I knew I couldn't face another day pretending I didn't know. A faint shuffle came from the hallway. Emily's footsteps, careful and slow, like someone trying not to wake a sleeping child. She must have used a different route home, maybe circled around the neighborhood to avoid suspicion. I slipped toward the kitchen, turning on a single overhead light. The pale glow cast my shadow long and thin against the tiled floor. I waited. My mind a tangle of anger, sorrow, and a strange calmness that comes only after you've seen something undeniable. When Emily stepped into the kitchen, she froze. We faced each other from opposite sides of the counter. Her hair was slightly windswept, cheeks flushed, eyes wide with alarm. She tried a smile, small, shaky, and utterly transparent. I couldn't sleep," she said, voice unsteady. "I went for some fresh air." I said nothing at first, just held her gaze. The silence pressed on us like a heavy weight. I saw her swallow, saw the flicker of panic in her eyes. She might have been rehearsing excuses on her way back, planning to tell me she'd only needed a moment alone to think about the festival, or that she couldn't rest after so much excitement. But I didn't give her the chance. "I know where you were," I said, my voice low but clear. "I followed you, Emily. I saw you with Margaret." She drew a sharp breath, her hand flying to her mouth as if to catch the words that wanted to escape. Her eyes glistened with tears, and I realized how exhausted she looked, torn between guilt and longing, caught in a trap partially of her own making. For a moment, no one moved. The clock ticked on unconcerned. "I never meant," she began, voice cracking. "I never wanted to hurt you." I leaned forward, pressing my palms flat on the counter. "But you did. You have," I said, each syllable measured. "I watched you kiss her, heard you talk about a past I knew nothing about. All these years, Emily, all these years, and I never knew there was someone else you loved like that." Her tears slipped free, silent but relentless. She shook her head as if that might undo what I'd seen. "It wasn't supposed to be this way," she managed. "Margaret left when we were young. I had no choice but to move on, to build a life without her. And I did. I tried to be happy with you, to be the wife you deserved." Her voice broke on that last word. I felt my anger waver, replaced by a hollow ache. The truth was too big to be contained by fury alone. "Did you love me?" I asked quietly, afraid of her answer. "Or was I always just an echo of something you'd lost?" Emily closed her eyes, tears darkening her lashes. "I did love you," she said. "I still care deeply for you. You've been kind, supportive, everything anyone could ask for. But I never forgot Margaret. When she came back, it was like the world shifted. Old feelings, old promises, they rushed back, and I couldn't shut them out. I couldn't stop a bitter laugh from escaping. So I was good enough until the real love of your life showed up at our door." My voice sounded strange in my own ears, hoarse, resigned, distant. "I gave you my trust, my commitment. We built this life together, and I believed we were honest with each other." She stepped closer, and I could smell the faint scent of orchard blossoms on her clothes. Margaret's scent, perhaps. I backed away, shaking my head. "Don't," I warned softly. "I'm not ready to be comforted. Not by you." Her face crumpled. "I wish things were simpler," she said, a plea that carried all the helplessness I'd seen in her posture beneath the trees. "I never meant to deceive you. When I saw Margaret again, I realized how much of my heart was still hers. I know how terrible that sounds. I looked at the woman I'd married, searching for some spark of the person I thought I knew. Instead, I found a stranger caught between duty and desire, past and present. So what now?" I asked, weary. "You can't have us both, Emily. Are you leaving? Running away together like you once dreamed?" She covered her mouth with a trembling hand. "I don't know," she admitted, voice muffled. "Everything I thought I understood about my life is in pieces. I'm terrified of losing you, of hurting you even more. But I'm also terrified of letting Margaret go again. I don't have a plan. I just know I can't pretend anymore." Her words landed like blows. There was no clean resolution here, no tidy ending. We were standing on the rubble of a marriage that might never have been solid. I felt something shifting inside me, an understanding that love isn't always fair, that we can't control how another's heart moves. "I deserve honesty," I said. "And if you can't give me that, if you can't decide, then I'll make the choice for both of us." Tears prickled at the corners of my eyes, but I refused to let them fall just yet. "I won't share you, Emily. I won't live in the shadow of someone else's love." She sobbed quietly. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "You're right. You deserve more. You deserve someone whose whole heart belongs to you." I nodded, swallowing hard. Her apology felt both necessary and insufficient. "I'm going to pack a bag," I said, voice steady despite the storm inside. "I don't know where I'll go tonight. Maybe a motel off the highway. But I need space to think about what's next for me. For us. If there even isn't us anymore, Emily reached out as if to stop me, but her hand hovered in the air. She knew she had no right to beg me to stay. What about tomorrow? She asked, voice breaking. What do I tell Margaret? My chest tightened at the sound of her name. That's not my concern. You'll have to face her and your own heart. I hope you figure it out. I hope you find what you're looking for. But I can't stand here and watch you tear yourself in two while I remain a silent bystander. With that, I turned and headed for the bedroom. I grabbed a small suitcase and stuffed in clothes without caring if they matched. Each shirt, each pair of pants felt heavier, as if laden with memories I could no longer trust. When I emerged, Emily stood near the door, tears tracking down her cheeks. I paused, considering a final word of comfort, but what comfort could I offer? This was the end of the story we wrote together. A new story, hers and Margaret's, might be just beginning. I stepped outside without another word. The night air was cool against my face, carrying a hint of dew and distant pine. The sky stretched wide and uncaring above me. I walked down the street, the weight of heartbreak pressing on my shoulders, my thoughts drifting to the orchard where everything was revealed. I didn't know what the future held, pain, healing, maybe one day even understanding. But I did know this. I had faced the truth, no matter how hard it was to swallow. Somewhere behind me, Emily might be crying. Margaret might be waiting. Let them find their path. I would find mine. And with every step, the bitter ache mingled with a strange sense of freedom. Love, once fractured, can never return to its original shape. But from broken pieces, we learn who we are and what we will not endure. In that quiet, lonely walk, I vowed never again to ignore the whisper of my own intuition, never again to settle for half-truths. I walked on into the dark, leaving behind the illusions we'd built, and embraced the uncertainty of whatever dawn might bring.